So anything that happens, it's my fault. Okay, well, thank you all for venturing out in person, even though you knew I was doing the presentation tonight, because you know I can talk about beer history. You know, you've probably gotten a lot of this already, but we are going to be talking tonight about the history of beer, specifically in America, how we have impacted beer and how beer has impacted us through a variety of different ways, shapes, and forms. I am the curator of the Brew-Archive at Cal State San Marcos, which is the archive of San Diego craft brewing from the 1980s to today. It's the most fun I have had in my entire career, I tell you. And I've thrown some coasters out on the counter over there because please take coasters. Once I get rid of the coasters, maybe I can get them to let me buy stickers. And I want stickers the next time around. But, okay, we'll see how well I do with this. Ooh, it worked. So before we actually get started talking about beer, I want to talk about fermented beverages in general in the New World or the Americas, however you want to call it. Being a historian, I sometimes use obsolete terms, and sometimes they're not completely politically correct, so I apologize for that right away. But of course, we had Native Americans doing fermentation before anybody got here from the Old World. Generally, it was chicha or pulque, as we know, corn or grain-based, but they did ferment other fermentable sugars as well, including what coming close to my heart is not the agave, but the cocoa. Fermented chocolate, I'm on board. You know, I'm right there. They also used honey. They used pretty much anything that could be fermented, and it was used in feasts and political negotiations a lot. I mean, if everybody's feeling pretty good, right, things might go a little bit better. Maybe that's what we need to do with the politicians now. Foam, I'm finding, was a frequent component. They had special little beaters to create foam in whatever the fermented beverage was. And, you know, of course, this is pre-written record, so we don't really know what made that so important. But I think it was partially because even now when you do sensory judging, right, you want foam on your beer to bring that sensory characteristics to your palate more strongly. So I think that's what they were doing. But then we did get the colonists, and the colonists were actually drinking a lot of cider, and so that's why we have cider to start with. Yes, please. If I have, the more pourers I have, the faster this will go, and the faster you'll be able to drink through all the beverages I brought. Also, I am a believer in having lots, so there's probably going to be plenty of leftover. Feel free to take it because my beer fridge is full. What we are going to start with is Twisted Horn's Earth and Sky cider. And the ciders back then were not what we think of as ciders today. They were brewed with any kind of fermentable fruit, basically. We didn't have modern apples in early America. The only apples you could even find were crab apples. And when talking to Mike, the cider maker at Twisted Horn, he did point out that the ABV would vary widely. The quality would vary widely because you were fermenting with whatever you had, and you know, even crab apples weren't making what we know as traditional cider. So what we have here is an apple and sweet potato cider. So, and I had it at Twisted Horn, and I thought it was real good, and I thought it was a good choice to bring. So it's very hard with our modern ingredients and our modern standards to bring you true to style beverages at that time. So I'm trying to bring something that kind of represents. So this is as close as I thought I could find at the time. Modern apples were not introduced into the Americas until about a couple of decades after we first started colonizing. And then of course they brought apples, maybe seedlings, but it still took years for those trees to bear fruit. So it was a long time before we had anything that would resemble modern cider even. And of course, the colonists that landed at Plymouth Rock, the legend goes, based on one diary entry in one of the Pilgrims' diaries, they landed at Plymouth Rock because they had run out of beer on the ship. Now, maybe that really did happen, but I don't think they actually ran out. I think what happened in reading some other accounts is that they were running short of beer, And the ship's captain had to take his crew back to the old world, right? And he didn't want to go with just water. So he said, you're landing here because we don't have any more beer. We don't have enough beer if we go any longer that we can't get back without our beer. But beer was very, very important because think about water being stored in wooden barrels for several weeks in untemperature controlled climate. It wouldn't be very nice, you know. I mean, so beer was very important because, of course, the alcohol content would make it a better shipping item, even though it probably still wasn't all that palatable after a few weeks. But, you know, what are you going to do? You got to drink something. And the colonists did drink, and they drank a lot. Everybody drank, including the children, although the children generally got watered-down beverages. They would get watered-down ale, although most ale was considered a small or table beer. And here's an interesting little sidelight because I couldn't find anybody doing a small beer. Andy had directed me to Anchor because they used to do a small ale. They've discontinued that. But in searching around locally, because I tried to feature all local breweries, I'm hearing that table beer may be coming out. You heard it here first. You know, so there's conversations going on in several of the breweries to bring out very low ABV table beer. They're not going to call it small beer probably because that just doesn't have the right ring to it. But people are familiar with table wine, right? So, table beer. Children also got cider, the hard cider, although again it was watered down and then it was called ciderkin. But what kills me is they wouldn't drink the water, so why were they cutting things with water and then giving it to the kids? You know, I can't find any rationale for that, but because of the variation in the ABV, you never knew how much you were going to consume before you were going to start getting drunk. You also had regional variants on the brewing styles and the beer styles based on the home country. I mean, we're all familiar with France. They were kind of in the south. We were familiar with England, of course, you know, British, and the British, you know, War of Independence from Great Britain. But the Dutch were also big on colonizing in the New World. They settled in the New York area, and they actually established the first commercial brewery in the New World in 1612. But New Manhattan was Dutch territory. But every single style of beer was different, and it was very important because you were going to drink anything but water. And that was because of the experience with tainted water in Europe. You know, you didn't drink water in Europe because of the industrialization, the population densities and all. They didn't think about coming to the New World. Water was probably going to be a little bit cleaner and better. You know, they brought their habits with them. And of course, on board the ships, like I mentioned, they also had things besides beer. Rum was a big one. The rum triangle, you may have heard about this in your history books. It was definitely founded and promoted by the British government. And why would they do that? Money. Whoops, what happened there? My connection is unstable. Well, yeah, I've been unstable many times. Yeah. I didn't touch anything, so I don't know what happened. Okay. See, I told you, the goddess of darkness strikes. But the rum triangle was basically the West Indies had sugar cane, which created, you know, they manufactured molasses. Molasses was then shipped to New England, which made rum. The rum was then sent to Africa, which was used to buy slaves. Slaves were brought back to the West Indies. Well, we're still having some excitement here. This is why I brought my notes, just in case. You can all see this, right? But also, whiskey was a very popular beverage. And it shipped well from the old world. So, but drunkenness was frowned on. Social drinking was fine and dandy, and of course, drinking for nourishment and for being hydrated was important. But drunkenness was frowned on. Another very popular beverage in the, yes, Patrick. Oh, that's okay. Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and I have not found any hard and fast. I think it, again, really depends on regionality. You know, some places you had much more strict Calvinistic type religious beliefs. Other places, a lot of the reading I was doing was saying that the Dutch were really pretty liberal about the drinking. So I don't think there were any hard, I think it was based on community standards. But, yeah. And with ABV varying, yeah. Yeah, they had no testing, they didn't know. Yeah. So, okay, we're getting there. We're getting there. But anyway, now we are going to be enjoying Ataraxia's Great Deliverer Porter. It's advertised as an American porter. And I don't know if you know about Ataraxia. They just opened up Memorial Day weekend. They are in the old Circle 9 location down in the Convoy area of San Diego. It's Darren Rudy is the brewer, and he was a brewer at Ballast Point for 10 years before starting out on his own. And so it's a very different vibe than Circle 9 and very different beers, and the things I've tried have been very good. And so they were very nice to us. Oh gosh, now I'm seeing myself. Let's see, I can see what I'm doing. Yeah, that's all I'm touching. I'm keeping my thumb off of it. So anyway, we're at the porter. And it certainly wasn't your modern beer. None of these beers were, just like the cider, all the fermented beverages. They were very different because of the ingredients. There we go, thank you very much. We certainly had the brewing knowledge. You know, a lot of it had come from the old world. They were aware of REINHEITSGEBOT, but that was German. We didn't have to follow that. We're starting something new in a new nation or a new area. There's all kinds of things that are, the rules have gone out the window. So the brewing practice was with local ingredients, things like spruce tips and corn and rice that were frowned on by German rules, and in places like England and Holland were simply not considered acceptable. And I think that's really starts our ingenuity. That starts marking, we want beer, we want something fermented, we're gonna have it no matter what. We're gonna find a way to make it happen, right? So we also didn't have the correct hops. We didn't have old world hops. And I've actually seen the California hop plant, and it is completely different than anything you would see in the way of the hops that you use in beer now. And it's not even usable in beer. It has a very different background in chemistry. And of course, we had limited technology. You know, they brought some brewing equipment with them, but for the most part, you're concerned about shelter first, food second, and then you can kind of get to your beer. You know, we had to prioritize here. And I found this in one of our, we have a lot of different old, you know, like 14th, 15th, 16th century digitized books through the library website. And I found this one, a speedy or present drink which travailers or workers may make for themselves when they are distressed for want of good beer or ale. And reading down here, it's using anise, sugar, and a branch of rosemary. Now, I don't know where you know, how does that substitute for beer, but, you know, they just, yeah. I mean, I guess it just, yeah, it was something, and it wasn't just plain water, I guess. I don't know, but, you know, some really interesting things were being brewed back then. But it's extremely important to the colonies. It's extremely important for, you know, health and nutrition. It's a socially approved refreshment. You know, it's okay to drink. You know, we didn't have, I mean, you certainly had pockets of extremely strict religious practitioners, but for the most part, it was, instead of water, you drank, and it was considered acceptable as long as you didn't get outrageously drunk and offend the moral code of your community. Also, think about this, in colonial times, we weren't making our own money. Whatever cash we had was British pounds or Dutch money or French money, whatever. So most of the time, we did barter and trade, and so alcohol was certainly something you could barter or trade. But the government didn't like a lot of this, because a lot of beer was home brewed. It was brewed for immediate consumption, it was brewed for use by the home, and the government isn't getting any money off of that. They're not getting any money from sale of it. They're not getting any, they have no way of knowing how much has been made. You know, so they institute things like the Stamp Act. This is a 1 penny stamp, which of course back in the 1600s, that was a lot of money that had to be attached to the barrels to prove that it had been licensed and paid for. But again, this is not something you can do to the home brewers. It's something that you only do for those that are selling what they've made. And again, Britain encourages rum consumption because that's very easily taxed, because they can see the transport of the molasses from the Indies and then the rum into Africa. And when we actually become a nation after our War of Independence, taxation is continued. The US government sees us as a way to support the government by taxing. And so in 1791, we have the Whiskey Rebellion, because whiskey and distilled spirits are being consumed at 4 times the rate of beer. That's according to the numbers that we know. Again, because a lot of beer was being home brewed, there's probably a lot more beer being consumed than this, but this is what they have record of. You know, I mean, we were bootlegging before bootlegging was popular, right? But this takes us into the early 1800s, late 1790s, the early 1800s, and we do have wet and dries that are actually going on record as either supporting or opposing liquor or any kind of spirits. Dr. Benjamin Rush, he's one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote this lovely essay, An Inquiry into the Effects of Spirituous Liquors on the Human Body, to which is added a moral and physical thermometer. And when this is loaded onto the website, you can click on that link and you can see the moral and physical thermometer. And it starts with water. If you drink water, you're healthy, you're smart, you're going to be successful and wealthy. And then it progresses up through beer, and then it goes to cordials and shrubs and things like that. And then it gets to things like whiskey, and you're an insane and dead. You know, so I mean, it got pretty extreme. In 1815, though, we have Joseph Coppinger, who's an Irish immigrant brewer who believes in the health and economic benefits of beer. He writes this lovely work over here, which this is the entire title of the book. And I love the fact that it's the American Practical Brewer and Tanner. I don't know quite how tanning works in with brewing. It just sounds kind of disgusting. Yeah, exactly. But you know, and actually, I've looked at a digital copy of the book, and it's like the last 4 pages are about tanning. The other 200 plus pages are all about brewing. So we can tell where his priorities were, because he actually argued for a national brewery to be established at Washington, D.C., because by that time we had established Washington, D.C. as our national capital. And he actually tried to work with Presidents Jefferson and Madison to get this brewery going. Well, obviously it never happened. Can you imagine what our world would have been like between then and now if we had actually had a national brewery, the government actually supporting brewing at that level? Exactly, you got it. Yeah. So now we're getting into the mid-1800s, and Judy and Lauren are keeping busy over here. We're going to enjoy Epic Brewing's Vienna Lager, because the mid-1800s is when lager comes into the United States. Now, the lager we're having is a lighter lager than what was originally developed in Germany. The original German lager was much darker, Dunkel type beer. This, you know, they didn't know about the yeast. They didn't know why beers did what they did. And we certainly didn't have that technology. We didn't even have the advances in refrigeration or how to keep things cool for those longer lagering processes. So this is something that's it's a new thing in the United States. Here comes this new beer. And we are seeing a drop-off in rum consumption. Part of that is because the British still control the rum trade, and anything we do in buying rum is supporting the British, and we're still kind of mad at them from 1776. And in the mid-19th century, so mid-1800s, we are getting an influx of Germans, and many of them are brewers. The reason they're coming into the New World is because the German states, it's not a unified Germany at this point, it's the German states. They're all having problems. They're breaking out with conflicts, and so a lot of Germans are leaving the old world and coming to the new world. They're bringing their brewing knowledge with them. And some of them brought lager yeast with them. Even though they didn't really understand what yeast was at that point, they did have ways of storing so the beer, then start a new batch. So they were bringing that with them. And as we're expanding westward, we're actually finding areas that we can actually grow barley. Because barley is not a New England type of product, and you can't really grow it in the South. So you've got to find that sweet zone in the middle. And we're still not into the middle plains area, but we're getting into areas where the climate and agricultural lands are much more amenable to growing things like barley, so we can make more traditional beers. We also don't have refrigeration until the mid-1800s. That is something that is invented after 1850. And so until we get that refrigeration, anything we do with lagers has to be done in places where you've got caves or places where you can keep it cooler, right? I mean, you're all brewers, you understand lager versus ale. And this is something that, so we were limited by the geography and by the lack of technologies that are being developed at this time. But we're inventive people. We find ways to make this happen because lager becomes more and more popular. And we do get refrigeration in about 1850 or so. I haven't found an exact date for when refrigeration is, the mechanics of it are introduced into the Americas. But, well, any kind of, to make ice or anything. But it was certainly the minute we had refrigeration, anybody who was brewing said, aha, here we go. And we're also expanding railways, we're expanding our transportation, we're creating better roads, so beer can now be sent. It's not just a home brew situation, it can be done at a commercial scale, it can be sold and disseminated much more widely than it's been because now we have refrigeration and infrastructure to do it in. Of course, where's our infrastructure now? I don't know, sorry, political comment. Beer consumption, from what I can find in 1850, the claims are made it was 1 gallon per capita. I think this again is low because of a lot of it was still being homebrewed, so records are going to be limited on how much was actually being consumed. But by 1900, it had gone to 24 gallons per person per year. So that shows you how American technology made beer much more available to everybody. It's hard to say when you see these statistics are, very easily twisted. So, whether it's per adult of legal drinking age, although there probably weren't a lot of drinking age laws then, whether it's everybody, only white males, because a lot of times censuses and things were counted just strictly by white males. It's hard to say. Yeah. But, yeah, settle down. Also, whiskey undercuts rum because, again, we're still mad at the British. We've really stepped back from our rum consumption. Whiskey transports even more readily than beer does because we don't need the refrigeration. And as we expand westward and we're moving into undeveloped areas, you still want something to drink at the end of the day. Woo. So you have whiskey that you take with you. So rum is kind of out of the picture by now. American lagers, of course, we tweak it because we aren't bound by the REINHEITSGEBOT. And we do have the necessary yeast now. We do have some challenges in geography and technology, but lager is described as being much more flavorful than the ales that are available. So it's becoming very popular. We also have an average ABV varies. We still don't have a real handle on the ABV, how you control it to where it's consistent. But this is an ad from 1906, San Diego Brewing Company, the first iteration. If you want to talk to me about San Diego Brewing Company, I wrote a whole article that was published in the British journal Brewery History a couple years ago on San Diego Brewing Company. But of course we have the Uncle Sam, and we have a German represented with a little spiky helmet. I know there's a name for that and I don't remember it. But there's all kinds of messages in here. The fact that Uncle Sam is standing and the German is kneeling, but reaching across the water. And then if you read the text, it's a well-known fact that American lager beer brewing is meeting with recognition even in Germany. So our patriotism is really starting to push drink American, consume American. Our stuff is better than anything you're going to get from Europe. You know, our nationalistic pride is coming to the fore here, which drives a lot of what we're going to be doing in the next few decades. But lager does have competition. And now we're going to have Bagby Beers Cream Ale. Fortunately, Bagby is closed on Mondays and Tuesdays and only opened up at 4 o'clock today for me to go get this for you. It was like, oh, please, 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 be open, be open. Cream Ale is, of course, an ale as opposed to a lager. It's a little lighter. It's a little bit maybe easier drinking, and we'll talk a little bit about steam beer, but I didn't bring Anchor Steam for you because I'm sure you've probably all had Anchor Steam, and we've already got 7 beverages we're drinking in this presentation. I just couldn't push you to, 8, 9, or 10. I wanted to keep my audience with me to at least a degree. So cream ales, I've seen a claim that they were developed to compete with lagers, and I have proof here that they were not developed to compete with lagers. Maybe they were promoted to compete with lagers, but cream ales were already being consumed in the States in the 1830s, where lagers were not introduced into the New World until at least 1840, 1842. So cream ales were already here. Now, they may have been promoting them as being more flavor and body, which is ads I've seen and claims I've seen, than the lagers that were being produced, because again, the refrigeration is still kind of iffy. The whole lagering process is something we're still working out. So it's interesting to see that but I've not found any record of cream ales anywhere in Europe. They seem to be just an American beer. So this is one of our early, it's ours and not anybody else's kind of beverages. I did find this fun. This little clip over here is from 1852. It's a little news piece. Lowell, Massachusetts had already passed Prohibition law. Maine was actually the first state to pass Prohibition, and they did that in 1846. So our Great Prohibition was just the culmination of a lot of smaller local laws. And the Europeans thought we were crazy. Why were we outlawing beer and liquor? But in Lowell, Massachusetts, they were pouring out a cask of cream ale, and it exploded and it sprayed all the onlookers. So the cream ale got... Okay. A terrible waste of a beer, but also it kind of got its own back to the onlookers there at least. But we also have at this time steam beer developing, and I have found a number of different legends about steam beer, and they all seem to be legends. This is one of the reasons I'm doing the Brew-Chive, is to make sure that the history of what's going on now is saved correctly, so we have accurate information 50 years, 100 years from now, because right now, even why steam beer is called steam beer is up for debate. I mean, we're probably all familiar with it was cooled in vats on rooftops in San Francisco, and the cool ocean air came in, met the hot wort, and you got steam. Well, I've also seen the claim that a man named Joseph Steam invented this style of beer. I haven't been able to find any evidence of anybody named Joseph Steam in San Francisco at this time period, but it was a pretty rough and ready era back then, so censuses aren't all that accurate and stuff. And so I'm going with the rooftop theory for now until I find something different. It was developed in California. It was developed to be a fairly quick drinking beer, something that was ready to consume in a fairly short amount of time. Because the gold rush, we had all these people coming into California and they wanted beer. A lot of Germans, when they landed on the East Coast in 1848, 1849, they saw how developed and how there wasn't really a lot of available land for them in the East. They jumped on wagon trains and came west as well. So a lot of brewers wound up in the gold fields, found themselves not making it in the gold fields because the claims were already grabbed by the time they got there. So they started breweries. So we wound up with 27 steam breweries in San Francisco. But by 1900, steam beer had lost popularity. We have a fully established railway system into California from the East Coast, so we're getting East Coast beers. Competition, the population has dropped. So what's left, Anchor Steam, which opened in 1896, so they kind of opened up right at the tail end of things, and they struggled along, closed in 59, revived in 60, and then Fritz Maytag took it over in 65, and the rest is very well-known history, so I chose not to bring it. But I did find this early 1934 Anchor logo. That's not very inspiring, kind of boring. But if you're struggling along, I guess you can't afford a designer for your identity. So also during this time, this is getting into the early 20th century, I put up what's REINHEITSGEBOT because really anything goes. There is no there's no federal food and drug laws or anything else. Any kind of suspect material can be put in beer or food or medicine. I mean, you probably are all familiar with snake oil salesmen and carnies and things like that. Well, beer suffered the same thing. All kinds of things were being put in beer to cut the cost and yet to have quantity to sell to people or to produce something quickly. And so what happens is in 1902, a man named Dr. Wiley, he established the Poison Squad. Isn't that a fun-sounding name? It's a really interesting book. There's actually a whole book about this. It was a group of young men who volunteered to consume various substances and see if it killed them or not. And a number of them did get quite sick. Well, as a result of Wiley's work with the Poison Squad, in 1906, we get the first federal law prohibiting adulterated food, beverages, and drugs. So we've kind of developed our own REINHEITSGEBOT, although various states had some sort of purity law over the years. This is the first federal level with any kind of teeth in it. But this is not the only legislation to impact beer. And you might get a hint from this little quote I have here about German enemies across the water. We have German enemies in this country too, and the worst of all are German enemies. The most treacherous, the most menacing are Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller. Yeah. Well, the guy's name is John Strange. I mean, come on. But he's a prohibition, but he's also the lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, so he has some political clout here. But he is kind of a symbol of what's coming with the noble experiment. And this, of course, refers to prohibition. And Lauren and Judy, if you will now serve our next one, which is Athletic Brewing's Upside Down Golden Ale. You may be familiar with Athletic Brewing. Athletic is a non-alcoholic beer. So if you haven't had one before, now's your chance. And so Prohibition, it hit the German-run breweries really hard. They were recovering from the impact of World War I, where we had very much a nationalistic, anti-German everything mindset within the country. So the breweries are just starting to recover from that. And here comes Prohibition in 1919. It took a long time for that law to actually pass, but it basically said you could ferment something if you wanted, but you couldn't sell it. You couldn't give it away. So that was really what it was. It wasn't so much you couldn't make it, you just couldn't do anything with it once you had it. So it had to be de-alcoholized or destroyed. And you've probably all seen pictures of the dry agents hacking open wooden barrels full of beer and the beer flowing out into the street or down into the sewer or whatever. And there was some of that. But also there were a lot of inventors who got real busy and said, well, let's take this beer and let's pull the alcohol out of it, because you can have a 0.5% beer, which is probably about what you're drinking right now. And this patent right here, White Ribbon beer, the food drink, because of course beer has always had that reputation of being nutritious and a form of food. This was actually invented by an Italian man who lived in Escondido and filed it in San Diego. So we were right there in the middle of everything with developing ways to de-alcoholize beer. Unfortunately, this particular patent had some legal problems, and it wound up establishing the White Ribbon Beer Company in LA. Fine, they can have it. And then it never really took off. It existed for about a year before White Ribbon disappears off the face of the planet. And yet Prohibition lasted for from basically 1920 until 1933. But there were actually other breweries that were permitted to continue to make beer because you could get a prescription for beer. It was considered a medicine. So I'm sure there were lots of doctors out there writing prescriptions for their patients for beer. They also, the wineries did not have the same sorts of restrictions that the breweries did. The winemaking industry they organized themselves and they really worked with the government to have lighter restrictions on wine. And they also could make the argument that wine was used in sacraments in the Catholic Church. So that gave them a little bit of an in as well. The brewers never really got it together. They kept contesting each other, but they also, if they'd been smart, at one point there were conversations between the brewers and the winemakers to join forces, and the brewers decided not to do that. And again, I think if we'd had a national brewery, and I think if we had affiliated with the winemakers, we probably would have maybe made it through Prohibition without quite the restrictions that we had. Yes.
Quick timeout. We have a car that is blocking another car, needs to be moved. We don't know if it's ours. It is a California license plate on a Honda 5NTZ196. Does that belong to us? It's a Honda with 5NTZ196. Do we know the color of the Honda? CRV? Nope. Okay.
See,
thank you for your attention.
Yeah, we are good people. We don't block other people. Okay, so Prohibition. There are challenges, of course, and there are solutions. The breweries that continue to operate, they re-engineer and they go into making malt syrup and powder. Now, of course, malt syrup, they advertised it in the newspapers and stuff. You could order it, have it sent to your home, and then you could make your own beer because they aren't going to know what you're going to do with that malt syrup, right? So there were people were still making beer at home. If they had refrigeration, they could do cheese, ice cream, other dairy products, or ice, and of course some of them converted to making industrial alcohol. Now the sad thing about the industrial alcohol is people were still drinking it, in order to get a kick. Well, the federal government started poisoning all industrial alcohol, and they made it very public knowledge to try to discourage people from drinking that stuff, and they did anyway. So there were a number of people who went blind, there were some deaths and other bad things from that. So the government kind of blew it on, trying to protect us from ourselves. You can see that Budweiser was making a near beer for 15 cents a bottle. I think that was kind of high priced at the time. Also, they had the challenges of when bootleggers were making their hard liquor, because hard liquor was a better bang for your buck. If you were going to go and try to break the law, what are you going to do? Are you going to brew beer, or are you going to make hard liquor that you can smell in smaller quantities for a bigger dollar profit? Well, most bootleggers went to the hard liquor, but they still had to dispose of their mash and offer evidence. So I love this ad. Somebody in LA got busted for feeding his pigs his mash, and the pigs got drunk, and the dry agents noticed it, so they went and arrested the guy for bootlegging. But there was no restriction from the newspapers who didn't agree with Prohibition law from running things like this to tell you how to make your own homebrew. And here we have corn, yeast cakes, raisins, and molasses. Obviously, he's run it through a distilling system. And his very smooth hairdo suddenly spikes up when he says not so bad. But newspapers could do this. There was no law against that kind of thing. I mean, you saw a lot of cartoons. You saw people writing ads or articles about, oh, you don't want to put raisins in your, whatever, your near beer because they will ferment and make an alcoholic beverage. I mean, that was the way they would say it. And of course, they would go, oh. So raisin stock went up, But so we were very creative throughout the years of Prohibition. But Prohibition was really, it was seen as a failure from the start, because guess what? When you're not allowing the manufacture of beer or other alcohol, you can't tax it. Then you don't get that income to the government. So even though it was federal law and various states like California passed laws making even more stringent rules against booze in their various states, it was it was not going to last because the government wanted that money. So the end of the Noble experiment means that we can now have 3.2 ABV beer, but not in California. We were stubborn. We passed the REINHEITS Act on top of the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act was the national prohibition law. The REINHEITS Act was our way of making it even harder with bigger punishment. And so it took us a while longer before we actually allowed 3.2 beer in California. The national brewery count grew from that about 100 that were operating throughout Prohibition to 750. Everybody opened up a brewery to get back on the bandwagon because there was a lot of concern about how everybody was going to be so thirsty. There was going to be such a rush on the existing breweries and saloons and stuff that they actually started letting people manufacture beer before Prohibition was over with, because they were like, oh, we're going to have to deal with this huge crush of people all wanting their beer. We're going to have riots. And so the brewery count stepped up very quickly. Big beer, especially the ones who had survived through Prohibition, either by being licensed, permitted to make alcoholic beverages, or had made alternative products, they stepped up. They did a lot of heavy advertising, but the high demand that existed led to a lot of shortcuts. So even though we had the federal food and drug purity laws, there were still shortcuts, shoddy ingredients, beers were not being aged long enough, all kinds of things were happening. So they covered a lot of these shortcuts up by serving it cold. So those of you who have been in Europe and gone into especially a British pub and your beer is warm, and that's not what we're used to here, well, this is where we get the cold beer from. It's covering up bad beer post-Prohibition. Because, yeah. So, and of course we had refrigeration and everything, but the ABV was allowed to climb up to around 4.6 as an average in your beers. But the law repealing Prohibition made a typo, which left home brewing illegal. Home winemaking was legalized, but somebody forgot to put the word "and beer" in, and so home brewing beer remained illegal until 1978 when President Jimmy Carter signed allowing that. So, otherwise you'd all be, yeah. Yeah. Some sad lessons are going on here. But then just as things are getting better, we're starting to get our beer back, ABV is climbing up, even though there's a lot of shortcuts being done and cold beer is now being introduced, we could get hit with the Great Depression. We just can't get a break in the 20th century. There's also the impact of World War II, which brings the anti-German sentiment again. So, the Brewers Association was actually investigated by the Congress in 1919 as being a possibly seditious organization. And the Brewers, it was called the United States Brewers Association at the time. They managed to skip through that, but they changed their canning, they changed their messages on their packaging and their advertising and everything to be very pro-US. We're not German, we're United States, we're loyal Americans. And so they wound up doing this again, because again, we're at war with Germany. We also have national economizing, where, of course, foodstuffs are being diverted to the war effort, metals are being diverted to the war effort, and we've started canning beer in about 1935. Glassware is short supply, manpower is in short supply, but there's a schizophrenic attitude in the military leadership about whether to allow the troops beer or not. There are some prohibitionists or temperance believers who are like, no, we don't want the troops being drunk. This is going to distract them. It's going to lead to, fights and low morale and blah, blah, blah. And then there's another more progressive side of the leadership who says, beer is one of the things our boys are fighting for. So what winds up happening is 15% of every brewery's production is earmarked for military, to make sure our boys had beer both here and in Europe or wherever they were fighting. And this I found in my research. It's just a little sketchbook done by an enlisted man. This is actually in, I believe it was North Carolina, but it's the PX Beer Garden. Which I thought that was really nice. They actually had a beer garden for the guys, and they weren't, before they even went off to fight, or maybe this is when they came back and they were recovering. It's an undated drawing, so I don't know exactly when it was during the war period. So we survive all of this. Post-World War II ABV, because we have had to do some shortages, so ABV dropped again, is ranging in the 4, although some 2% beer. So we're kind of back to that small table beer ABV again that the colonists had. Everything cycles back around. National brands advertise quality control and flavor consistency. Those are their big selling points. It's like, yes, you can go anywhere and have a Bud or a Schlitz, and it will be the same beer as you had when you were over, 400, 500, 600 miles away or across the country. So those are their big selling points. So the local brands couldn't really necessarily make that argument because, if you're selling locally, somebody's going to go to Minnesota from California and they're not going to find that California beer. So the local brands, bye. The local brands had to compete on price, and that took a lot of them out of the competition. I mean, you're operating on a pretty slim margin already. The big beer guys have the ability to buy in larger quantities. They can buy product out from underneath you. They can contract, there's a lot of kind of shady business practices going on in the mid-20th century even. So our brewery count drops to about 450. Either because they just simply closed and went out of business, like Aztec Brewing did in 1943. It was bought up by Altes Brewing from Detroit. And then it closed in 53 completely, and that's just a San Diego example. So there was some consolidation and there was a lot of going out of business, unfortunately. But this brings us to the mid-20th century, and here's our example of the one big beer. And boy, I really regretted buying this, I tell you. I almost brought you all bottles of water instead. Yeah, so, beer pong, there we go. But in the mid-20th century, we're back into an era of prosperity. Things are doing much better. Big beer, of course, is looking for ways to get new corners of the market. So they come out with low-calorie beer. Now, the reason you are getting Coors Light, even though Miller Lite was the first light beer produced, is because you can blame it on San Diego. I'm serious. Miller Lite was the first light beer, but in May of '78, Coors introduced light beer in San Diego, Denver, and Corpus Christi. It was a test market, 3 test markets to see how it would go, and if it went well, it was going to go national, right? Well, October 1978, this is just a sample. The packaging hasn't really changed all that much, has it, over the years? We're talking, 40 years ago, and it still looks like this. Well, in 1979, Coors Light is the #1 beer in San Diego. Shame on you all. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So because it was so popular in San Diego, they sent it national. But also, they were encouraged by how San Diego had received their beer. So in May of '80, they bring in their super premium beer, Herman Joseph's 1868, and test market that in San Diego, which also did well, because we're actually seeing a trend to premium beers as well in the early '80s. Yep, January 1979, this is from the San Diego Union. Yeah, so like 8 months later, it was the #1 selling beer in San Diego. I don't know, maybe the shipments of all the other beers got blocked off somewhere and didn't make it into California. But, so yeah, that's our fault. But Schlitz also took a page from Coors' book and test marketed their Erlanger in San Diego, but that doesn't seem to have lasted too terribly long from what I can find out about it. So, but then in the 1980s, of course, we did have a recession. And consumption rates of alcoholic beverages grew, but what was being consumed definitely shifted to lower priced beers, which knocked out kind of your hard liquors because they were much more expensive, which is kind of funny because here in Prohibition, bootleggers are making hard liquor to sell because they can get a better bang for their buck. 60 years later, we are going to the cheap beer because you can drink more of it for the same dollar. But in 1978, as I said, Jimmy Carter brings legal status to homebrewing. So we see a homebrewing renaissance, and winemaking supply shops start converting over to carrying homebrewing supplies as well. Because, of course, we didn't have the internet. We couldn't order stuff online. And so that helped local homebrewing, because we did have wine crafts in San Diego, which was run by the Ekblums, and Audrey was both a winemaker and a home brewer, and when homebrewing became legal, and wine crafts closed. It was a national chain, and they closed this store, or they were going to close it. Audrey and Owen bought it and then added the beer, and it became Beer and Wine Crafts. And at one point, they did have a homebrew shop up in San Marcos as well. But Audrey, a lot of the OG homebrewers I've talked to, like Rich Link and Skip Virgilio, people like that, talk about how they used to go in and talk to Audrey and bring her beer and say, "What's wrong with my beer?" You know, because we didn't have really homebrew clubs then, so you had to go to somebody who was recognized as an expert and say, you know, what am I doing wrong, or, you know, can I fix it? And so I give big chops to Audrey and Owen for helping San Diego get where it is today. In 1983, California passed laws allowing brew pubs, because even though you could be a home brewer in 78 to 83, you couldn't sell your beer. You were allowed to give it away, and that was it. So brew pubs, you could sell your beer, but you had to have food with it. And so that's why we had Fergie's in the 80s out in Fallbrook. He was illegal. From what I understand from the people who actually visited Fergie's, he was the first brew pub in San Diego County out in Fallbrook. He put a bowl of pretzels on the counter and said, "That's the food." Yeah. Well, he was not licensed. The city, you know, the county was not aware of him or anything, because Chris Kramer of Karl Strauss, which is the first legitimately recognized brew pub in San Diego, when he went into the city and the county to try to open up a brew pub, they were like, "Well, we don't know what to do, you know, I mean," and he goes, "Well, what about Bolt," which was also open, and because Bolt had bought out Fergie, and they said, "Bolt, who's Bolt?" And so Bolt got forced closed because they also were not licensed, and so so Karl Strauss is the first legitimately recognized legal brew pub in San Diego County. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, Bolt was certainly not at the scale. Yeah, yeah, but Fergie's / Bolt was never at the scale that Karl Strauss envisioned themselves to be. And Karl Strauss, by the way, was Old Columbia before they were Karl Strauss. But what we're seeing now in the 1980s is the homebrewers, a lot of them, you know, and talking to the OG homebrewers, a lot of them say, I say, "Why did you start homebrewing?" And they said, "Well, because I wanted beer that was cheaper than what I was buying in the store," which kind of reflects this recession mindset of, you know, things are getting too expensive, and I got to save some money. But then they started realizing that they could make more flavorful beers. They could make, you know, beers that were more European in style, you know, giving a nod back to our ancestral roots here. And they started reviving styles, and they started inventing new things and trying new adjuncts and new ingredients and new proportions of ingredients and things like that. And San Diego has been really up in the lead of that. This handout right here that you can't really see, you can go to this website and you can see this much better. This is a home winemaking shop's instruction sheet for how to make clone beers. I think there's Budweiser and Miller and Sierra Nevada in here, you know, with, you know, and that's from Greg Lorton, who's a, you know, member of Quaff. And I just thought, really, you know, that's what you want to do, is you want to homebrew and make the same beer, but it is evidence of the mindset we had. You know, you thought that those commercial beers were too expensive, so you figured you could make it at home for cheaper. So the early 21st century, here we go with our final beverage. I talked about being inventive and creative and trying new things, pushing the envelope. So I brought California Wild Ales. 2020, it's been a very sour year. It's a blueberry sour. And I thought that label was absolutely perfect to describe what we've all been through this past year. And they are doing a lot of barrel-aged stuff down in Sorrento Valley. It's quite wonderful, and they just opened up a tasting room down in OB. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of expansion and things going on. This is actually their label. We're seeing a variety in hops. I mean, we were hearing about experimental hop styles and things earlier. People are trying different adjuncts. And I'm seeing a lot of collaboration, which is one of the things that really sets San Diego apart from a lot of the other breweries and brew clubs that I see nationally. I'm seeing amateurs, home brewers working with pro brewers working with each other, sometimes 2 and 3 breweries, or 3 and 4 breweries working on a beer. And then we see things like Black is Beautiful, where the recipe is released by the brewery that developed it and said, you know, go out and make this beer, but, you know, make sure some of your proceeds go to the Black Lives Matter movement or another movement like that. So we're doing a lot of really cool things that we would not have seen, and I'm not sure that we're seeing things like that quite in Europe. And of course, we all know about how Stone Berlin didn't cut it, so I think they're not ready for us yet. Big beer, though, I see it continues to economize on ingredients, but they're also trying to get into the craft beer scene by buying up small craft breweries, and we've certainly seen that happen even in San Diego. But then we also see a lot of times that the product gets changed due to economizing to scale. We are seeing a lot of technology improvements which can only make your brewing lives easier, right? Maybe they're more expensive, I'm sorry to say, but you know, if it's a new tool that makes your brewing more accurate or produces a better beer or, you know, just gives you something new to learn about, I think that's always a positive thing. But we're also seeing changes in legislation, which I think really help improve our beer and what we can do in the industry. There's, of course, always the driver of tax revenue. But with COVID, a lot of the regulations that were really limiting, especially the smaller craft brewers in San Diego, have gotten lifted. They all say they're temporary, but it's like they can do outdoor seating now. They've been able to ship beer. A lot of the small craft breweries, even though they might be canning for, you know, local distribution, they were limited in how they could distribute, how far they could distribute their beer. Well, now they can start they're shipping things. That was all allowed during COVID. And what really got a lot of brewers upset, and you may have heard about this, the California Craft Beverage Association, along with some local breweries, including Virginia Morrison of Second Chance. She's actually a lawyer, but she's now, you know, the CEO of Second Chance Brewing. They brought a lawsuit against the state of California because wineries were not restricted the way breweries were during COVID. You know, breweries had to shut down completely. Wineries were allowed to continue to run their tasting rooms. You know, real disparity in treatment, you know, which is a holdover from Prohibition era. So a lot of that stuff has been changed, and let's hope that it opens it up. It shows the government that brewers can be responsible. They're definitely a benefit. It's tax revenue and to a lot of other creative and wonderful things, and establishing reputations in San Diego as a tourist center for our brewing. And, you know, I'm hoping for only bright lights and good fortune ahead for all of us. So summing up, we've always had a need / desire for fermented beverages. There have certainly been barriers and challenges, but those barriers and challenges, combined with the local materials and technologies and our American ingenuity, have led us to beer in all its glorious styles that we enjoy today. And of course, my thank you to Andy especially, and Twisted Horn, and the pourers, Lauren and Judy especially, and of course all of you. And if you have any questions, fire them at me. The PowerPoint will be on the website, and I do have some notes down on the bottom, so look for those, and there's some active links in there that you can click on. I'm sure there's plenty of beer left over there, so we can do a ceremonial pouring of the drain.
So Judith,
Hey, Louie, you're back there.
I'm here hidden away in the back. So you kind of jumped from the 80s to modern day. Did anything notable happen in between that
Oh,
time?
IPAs, it's just,
All right.
I did mean to say something about IPAs. I get a little, jumping ahead of myself. I'm sorry. I'm a very extemporaneous speaker. Having to follow slides is very hard for me. IPAs, you all brew IPAs. You're very familiar with them. I think that's a whole presentation in and of itself, the history of the IPA coming from Britain and how it came to the U.S. and how it's been changed here and how we have double IPAs and, all kinds of wonderful things going on there. It's just, it was like, I can only pack so much stuff in here before you guys are all going to want your sleeping bag. Yeah. And really, the focus of my research is really more towards the breweries themselves, how they conduct business. And I will tell you all right now, my big thing today, besides getting through this presentation, and thank you all for being so patient with me, is Dean Jacobson of the San Marcos Brewery and Grill brought me a donation today of some things from San Marcos Brewery, which of course closed at the beginning of COVID. One of them is the really big sign that was in the entranceway. It was like a huge sign. And he goes, "You don't know the number of people that wanted to buy this." And I'm like, "But you gave it to me." So I am continually on the hunt and, trying to preserve that history. And, Dean has promised me an oral history about, he actually told me a story today while we were talking, and I'm going, my brain is exploding. Why don't I have my recording equipment right here so I can be recording this? He was saying that when Greg and Steve of Stone were going around visiting breweries before they opened Stone, they sat at San Marcos Brewery and quizzed Dean on opening a brewery, and they were taking notes on cocktail napkins. They hadn't even come in prepared to take notes. So, yes?
How you got particularly into this role. So I've known Judy for a couple years, but I love her story because of her relation to the school and how she got involved in beer. So would you share, please?
Okay, well, this comes from a woman who was not drinking beer. And I got called into my dean's office one day, and that's all like going to the principal's office. You're like, oh man, what have I done? And she's there with her assistant dean, who happens to be a home brewer, which I didn't even know that at the time. And they said, what have we got on beer history in the history collection? And I said, well, nothing. Nobody's ever asked me for history because I'm the history librarian. I buy what my students need, and I find resources for my students, and they're doing things like, the Japanese American incarceration and other aspects of California history. Well, Char, the associate dean, says to Jen, my boss, and I, she goes, well, somebody ought to be collecting San Diego beer history because it's just exploding around here. And I'm going, and what's all this conversation about? Well, Cal State San Marcos, in the CSU system, if we are proposing a new program, it has to go through all the various units in the campus that are going to be affected by it. And of course, it comes to the library because any program needs materials for supporting research, right? So there's going to be a beer brewing certificate program called the Engineering program. And I was just like, oh, okay, well, news to me. But there's a class, it's going to be a beer history class. So what have we got on beer history? And I said, we don't really have anything, but San Diego State and UCSD both have brewing programs that, Char was aware of. And I said, well, I'll check them out and, we'll find out who's collecting beer history. Somebody must. And to my aghast, nobody was. And so I go back to the two of them and I said, nobody is collecting San Diego beer history. San Diego History Center has some, but it's all pre-prohibition, maybe to the 1950s, and there's not much there because nobody saved anything. And so, of course, they both go, well, then we've got to do it. And I said, you mean me, white women? Because I'm the person that goes out and does stuff. You two are administrators. So I boldly venture out to a couple of breweries. And again, this is a woman who doesn't drink beer. And I go in and I sit down and I, get the smallest little taster of beer. I don't even know if you called that a taster. I mean, it was like, can I just have the little glass? And started talking to a few people, and they were like, I said, well, we're looking to save San Diego brewing history. And everybody was so positive and so excited and so, oh, you need to talk to this person, and have you talked to so-and-so yet? And I mean, they're throwing names at me and, you know, places and everything else, and I was just like, and so I went back and I said, okay, you know, we're a go. These people are great, and there's definitely a story to be told here, and we need to save this evidence because I'm already hearing about breweries that no longer exist. So for that was in 2016. In 2017, we actually made a formal launch at the Stone anniversary event at the campus, which they had always annoyed me because coming out of the library, I had to wend my way through all those fences and everything for a week while they were setting up. And I was like, oh, now I'm here, you know, gee. With a little table with a few things on it that some people had given me, you know, a couple old growlers and a tap handle or two and stuff. And, you know, people would come by and say, what are you doing? You know, or push their tasting glass at me, and I'm going, I don't have any beer. You know, I've got some coasters, you know. But, you know, started telling people what I was doing, and people just really got into it and got really excited, and it was just, the beer community, both homebrew and pro, are incredible and supportive, and I admire your tenacity, your inventiveness, your creativity, and I've learned so much about beer and, you know, everything but an IPA. I just can't drink the IPAs, I'm sorry. That's another reason I skipped it. But, you know, I mean, it's been the most fun part of my entire job, and I just love I mean, I walked into Bagby today to pick up the cream ale, and I told her, I said, I'm so glad you're open at 4 because I'm doing a presentation today at 6, and I got to have this beer. And she kind of looked at me, and I said, well, I'm a beer historian. That's the way I introduce myself. And she just got so excited. When I walked out, I heard her telling everybody else in there, she's a beer historian at Cal State San Marcos. And I was just like, yes, score another one for the university. And, you know, while I was in there, Jeff Bagby came out, and he and Dandy did an oral history with me. You know, usually my oral history recordings are an hour, 2.5 hours. My battery was running out of my recorder. But, you know, he had so many things to tell about, you know, working at Pizza Port and working that short period at Stone as a driver, and just, you know, so much can be learned. And, you know, I'm doing it mostly to support the students in the engineering program. But then I went and presented at a conference and found that there were a bunch of other beer scholars. I wasn't the only one. I thought I was kind of this weirdo out here in the edge of something. And oh no, there was a guy from Britain talking about how politicians use pubs as places to meet with the common people, and which you don't really do that here. You know, so I'm already seeing differences, and I'm seeing trends and all kinds of things. And it's wonderful. I really enjoy it. But thank you for asking, because I love telling that, you know, story.
Judith, thank you so much. And I'd like to propose a toast to Judith Downey. Yeah. Yep. Very cool. All right. I understand there might be a couple of more announcements before we get all the way done. Sean, real quick.
Thank you. Judith, that was awesome. I mean, that was really, really fun to hear. And, you know, bringing Coors Light into it, that's daring. Very. I'll admit it. Hot summer day. I don't need any of my 7% beers. Okay. I did get a couple texts and some questions. So Raul from Carlsbad Homebrew Supply, he had sent out some emails asking about a survey. They're thinking about going back and adding another day to the post-COVID schedule. So if you haven't got a survey, you want to just send them an email saying, hey, I'd like this day. Right now, they're open Wednesday through Saturday. So I'm not influencing anything, but I said, open on Sunday, darn it. But whatever. So there's that. And then the other one was, he would like a heads up, given we're all going to do something interesting with the Big Brew. In years past, the Big Brew had caused a run on certain types of yeast. So if you know what you're looking for, just send them an email saying, hey, I'm going to be looking for this yeast in next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whenever you plan on pitching it. So anyway, Raul had asked that I'd throw that out there, so I figured I would. He's our local homebrew supply or shop. So that's all I got.
Thank you. Thank you. So, I'm sorry, yes, you have a, real quick.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you again. So, this is a question, an idea, a call to help, perhaps. But one thing that I feel has been really great that's happened over the last 16, 17 months is we've been able to drink our beers and eat our food outside. It's fantastic. And I know I saw Nick say a while back that this is extended to the end of the year. Is there any update on that, or is the end of the year the cutoff? So right now we're good through the end of December, but there's legislation that may need to change. I don't know how to do this, but I want to help change that legislation. I think it would be really neat if San Diego became the al fresco dining capital of San Diego. Dude, did I say that twice? I'm sorry.
He's on a roll.
Of California.
He's on a roll. Let him go.
I'm really enjoying going down to Virgin Beer and sitting underneath their little umbrellas and such out in the beautiful San Diego weather all the time. I dress like this. You guys know me long enough. All the time, right? Let's go sit outside. So can I start a discussion? Can I ask some questions? How do we move this idea forward where we email, we call the right people, and we say, hey man, let's make this happen in San Diego? Okay, we have an idea. People are on the internet.
Everyone on the internet who could not be here, but I wish you were here. Anyway, you should send a list of places we can write, or places we can email, or places we can put our word in for that to happen, right? Send it to everyone so that we can...
So that's a great idea. I'm doing that right now. Who do I email? Nick, can I ask you, do you know the people?
ABC.
ABC Sacramento. Okay. So,
All right.
So if anybody hears any grumblings, any rumblings, this is a homebrew movement here, right? Let's start things happening. I see Judy, give me 1 second. I see this happening. I want to get behind it. I want to bring you guys into it. Let's all send an email and let's drink our beers outside. Let's eat our food outside. It's so great.
All right.
For those on the internet, Derek said, this is for those who never want to wear pants again, or something like that. But Pat, the San Diego Brewers Guild, the California Craft Beverages Association, they are organized already. I'm sure they're seeing the benefits of this for their members, so leverage that.
All right. All right.
Restaurateurs feel the same way. They want to keep their street side dining.
I am nominating myself right now to act as the person for this homebrew club.
I second that nomination.
To get outdoor eating and drinking in San Diego.
All right. I have one more announcement. We still have some Heretic 2-packs. So right now, $10 each. So anybody who wants them, even if you got yours before, if you want to stock up on some more, it's really good beer, and it's available. And it is, oh, criminy, my computer just gave out. So it is social time, and cleanup is fun. Right, Derek? All right. And we're running out of time, so we need to kind of wrap it up.